Of the roughly 2.3 million people who are currently incarcerated in the United States, about 500,000 or 20% are defendants being detained in our nation's jails, awaiting trial or case adjudication. Most are held because they cannot afford bail. Pretrial detainees are often the poorest of the poor, arrested as much, if not more, for being offensive to the broader society than for having broken laws of any significance. Most are released on the day of arraignment or within 1 week, but the average stay is roughly about 3 weeks or a little over 3 weeks. But spending any more than one day behind bars awaiting case adjudication can lead to many harms. In absolute and relative terms, jails are awful places. This is not simply because, as Sykes pointed out in 1958, people are incarcerated in jails, lack liberty, autonomy, sexual relations, and communication with the outside world. The suffering goes well beyond these complaints. With poor and unstable funding, jails tend to be and tend to employ staff who are underpaid and poorly trained. Inmates are housed in facilities that are often made unsafe, unsanitary, and lacking adequate space. They offer limited, if any, programming to occupy and engage inmates. They have rules and regulations that are inconsistently enforced, but punitively sanctioned for noncompliance, making daily life unpredictable and volatile. Jails are breeding grounds for the spread of disease, infectious disease, and violence, and they provide healthcare and other essential social services that are meager at best. A distressing reality given the disproportionate that people who are incarcerated in jails are a heterogeneous population disproportionately beset by a number of often untreated chronic health conditions, mental health illnesses, and substance abuse problems. It is the very fact of incapacitation, especially so when it is unexpected, these conditions of confinement and the use of these conditions by system agents to wring guilty pleas from detainees that contribute to making pretrial detention so destructive to the lives of those captured in its web. Recent research finds that pretrial detention increases the likelihood of conviction on current charges, in large part because of plea deals that detainees take to gain release as soon as possible. It leads to more severe sentences with conviction. It harms individuals' physical and psychological well-being. It reduces employment likelihood, lowers wages and annual earnings. It increases the burden of legal financial obligations. And the focus of my next book project, it increases the likelihood of future penal system involvement. For the overwhelming majority, it is imperative to get out as soon as possible before those harms start to accumulate. Few do so without assistance. Few can do so without assistance. Today, I will present preliminary findings about who received help, who went without, and why. In other words, what factors are associated with social capital mobilization for survival and release from pretrial detention. I want to highlight before jumping into this discussion about those who continue to advocate for this current system. For those who do, they argue that the money bail system essentially allows individuals of all financial means to leverage their social networks and community ties to obtain pretrial release. In other words, if you're anyone worth your ilk, your social ilk, people will come to your aid and get you out. We know, however, that the overwhelming majority of folks who are released pretrial from pretrial detention do not engage in future do not get involved in new criminal activity, and they also show up for their court hearings. And so this idea that we would have to hold people to a system where they would have to come up with money to be able to exit seems to make no sense. And then second, for those sociologists among us, we know that the very factors that make it difficult for some to get out of jail because they're too poor to pay are also factors that make it really difficult for them to be able to leverage these social networks that some of the advocates for the system point to. Today, I want to begin the discussion by describing who helped detainees during detention, both to survive detention, but also to get released, and also what types of help they provided. This is going to be the focus of my discussion. Because of time limitations, mine is a qualitative study, and I really kind of dig deep into the data and provide you a sense of the richness of this data. I won't describe the body of the research relevant to this set of questions. I'd like as much time as possible to share preliminary findings and then get some feedback from you all. This, again, the questions that I will be asking are around who received help to survive pretrial detention and for release, and who went without, and why is that the case. I rely on data that was collected by my team between 2016 and 2019. It's a convenience sample. It's a 163 ethno-racially diverse men and women. It was a convenience sample recruited from San Francisco Pretrial Diversion Project. These are only low risk. In order to be able to get into this particular program, you had to be a low risk, low level defendant who is diverted to these programs. The arrests and related charges are dismissed after program completion. So these folks do not have on their records this arrest and related charges once they successfully complete the program. My team interviewed respondents roughly 3 years after the arrest that put them on our radar. This gives them more than enough time to engage in new criminal activity if that were the case, since the overwhelming majority of those who recidivate do so within 18 months to 3 years of having that arrest. I should also point out that the San Francisco study is a part of a broader project that includes interviews in Houston, Louisville, and Chicago. And so it's the broader book project will encompass all of those, the data from all of those cities. Respondents were queried about their personal background, their affiliations, the extent and nature of their substance abuse and mental health issues, because this is so important for understanding, especially those who have frequent contact with the system, arrest, detention, and diversion histories, their perceptions about the legitimacy of legal authorities, and their pre-release integrative experiences. I had a 5-member coding team that adopted a both deductive and inductive approach to data coding. Each transcript was read by 2 coders to ensure intercoder reliability. After reading the transcripts, my team and I developed many theories based on the findings from prior research, respondents' interpretations of their own circumstances, and we also developed our own thinking about the meaning of the responses that respondents shared. We then identified negative cases in order to kind of test our understanding of the mini theories that we developed and tweak them in ways that incorporated what we learned from these negative cases, and then tested theories with associational analysis. To give you a sense of what this sample looked like, of course, they're predominantly men, as is the case with regards to those who are involved in the criminal legal system. Roughly a third of my sample was white, about a quarter were Latino. Over 40% had some college, 24% a high school diploma or GED, less than 10% had dropped out of high school for this particular sample. And about 60% of my respondents reported that their household income was $50,000 or less. So who helped detainees, and what type of help did they provide? I will begin with this set of questions before moving on to explain who actually got help, what are the attributes or characteristics of those who did receive help. To start, I'll let you know that of my respondents, about 72% said that they received some kind of help, any kind of help during this process, both to survive detention, but also to gain release. So who helped detainees? Not surprisingly, family members showed up huge in terms of the assistance that people provided. 65% reported that that the help they received, some of the help that they received came from family members. Most of those who helped within the context of the family were mothers and sisters. To a lesser extent, fathers were also present, and fathers were more likely to be involved when it involved gaining bail. One of the things that I did not expect when beginning this project was the role that inmates would play in helping detainees to both survive and get released from pretrial detention. Over 1/3 of our respondents reported that the help that they received, or some form of help that they received, they got from inmates. Partners, friends showed up at lower rates. 26% said that they received help from partners. 16% of those who got help said that they received help from friends. Penal agents and bail agents, and from here on, I combine them, also served as a source of support for a few. What type of help did social ties provide? Here, we're speaking specifically about family members, partners, and friends. So emotional support, of course, is not surprising. 56% said that the assistance that they received from social ties came in the form of emotional support. Roughly 50% said that they received help securing bail. 32% reported that their social tie contacted someone else on their behalf to let them know what's going on. So employers, one's school ties, etc., to let them know what was going on. A little less than a quarter received help with childcare. The list goes on. Penal system agents, again, weren't a huge source of support, at least in terms of percentage who received aid from them, but they did provide support. A little over a quarter helped in contacting loved ones. One quarter, a little over a quarter, provided flexibility in terms of rules. Later, you'll see how important this becomes in terms of people being able to get the information and other forms of assistance that they needed to survive. A fifth said they received information, and then proportionally fewer got emotional support, handling property, etc. And then finally, inmates. Again, they show up huge in ways that I did not imagine. 50% of those who received aid from inmates said that assistance came in the form of information. 42% said that they relied on other inmates for emotional support. They also received supplies and protection from inmates when they were in danger. So who did what exactly? So family again showed up in a huge way. They were critical in terms of securing bail, handling property. For instance, if your car was parked on a road and needed to be moved before it got towed, family members would show up and engage in that kind of activity. Friends were also an important source for handling property. Family members were critical in terms of contacting others. They were also huge in terms of emotional support. But I want to point your attention again to what it is that inmates are doing. For those who received information, 75% of those who received information got that information from other inmates. Again, this was about surviving in the context of jail, but it was also about what they needed to do in order to get released. So they ended up being a huge resource in that regard. And we can see how that matters with regards to the number of days that people are spending in detention. Here you see it by the forms and sources of assistance that they received. Notice that those who got bailed out spent on average the least amount of attention in jail. I'm focusing primarily on the median figures here. Spent about a day in jail if you were bailed out. The asterisk indicates for those who were bail eligible. So of those who were bail eligible and were bailed out, they spent on average 1 day. For those who received information as a form of assistance, they spent a day and a half. For emotional support, 4 days. In some ways that makes sense because the longer you're in, the more support you're going to need in terms of keeping up your spirits and helping you to get through the process. So that was associated. So for those who received emotional support, they spent on average 4 days. You should also notice to the right side of the screen, the number of days that people are spending on average when they receive help from different sources. Notably, when people reported receiving help from penal system agents, they spent the least amount of time in jail. The information that those agents offered often helped them to deal with the process. They knew what they were supposed to do. They knew how they were supposed to do it. The issue is that penal system agents don't often make themselves available, and you'll learn a little bit more about that later. Inmates were also critical. It wasn't just about what they could expect in terms of the process of living in jail. It was also key and critical information that folks needed about how to get out. For instance, one of my respondents reported that while sitting in jail, it was probably about his second day in jail, the person he was in the cell with said if you have money, you could just get yourself bailed out. This particular respondent had no idea that that was a possibility. And so this person told him how he could do it. He immediately called his partner and began the process of getting bailed out. He had not been informed by system agents in any way, shape, or form that this was a possibility. So it was the inmate who informed them and allowed for the process to begin for his release. And he was released soon after that because he got himself bailed out. So this is just one example of how inmates become critical in this process, both in terms of emotional support, but also the kind of information that helps in terms of getting out. So who received help, who went without? What I'm about to share now are some preliminary thoughts to highlight the factors that emerged as important after our coding and analysis. I'm going to highlight primarily two of my respondents, Mary and Jesus. So Mary is a 24-year-old Black woman, San Francisco native. She's a second generation immigrant. Her parents were from Nigeria. She was single at the time with no children. She was attending a four-year college, working towards a four-year degree, while also working part-time as a nanny, making about $25 an hour. Just shy of her 22nd birthday, she was arrested for second-degree robbery and drug possession, two felonies. She spent about 16 hours in jail before being bailed out. Mary received different sources, received support from different sources and also different kinds of support. In terms of emotional support, what jumped out here again was the aid that other inmates provided, system agents, and particularly the bail bondsman here, and also friends. She received information from inmates, also from penal system agents. The penal system agent was the bail bondsman who contacted her friends to let them know that she was in jail and in need of assistance. And then in terms of securing aid, her friend stepped up for her to help her to pay bail and help her get out of jail. She didn't want to call her family members because she didn't want them to know about it at all. So her friend did that. And the bail bondsman also was very important, critical in terms of allowing for that process to move forward, as you will learn more about very shortly. So there are three sets of things that come up with Mary's case that I think is important to mention. First is household income. Because we're a socioscientists, I don't know that I feel like I need to go into great detail about the importance that household income plays. If you don't have the money, it is very difficult to come up with bail when you live in households where those kinds of resources are available. It's much more likely to happen. Gender and age end up interacting in really interesting ways, and in ways that both highlight the stereotypes of criminality and ideas that are associated with who's redeemable and who's not, but also the kind of behaviors, or dare I say, performances of innocence and helplessness that lead some to get help and others not to. And then I consider the importance of first arrests. I'm going to go through household income very quickly because it's obvious. And so I don't want to take up a lot of time with it. It becomes really key in terms of getting help with bail. Mary lived in a household that she said had at least $50,000 among the folks who lived in that household. She roomed with two other people that she described as having real jobs, and so she estimated that they were making enough so that the overall household was at least at $50,000. What we see is that to the extent that you live in those kinds of households, a really high percentage of those folks get help securing bail. Not surprising in any way. Those households also are associated receiving help from different sources. So 58% reported getting help from family, 25% reported help getting from friends, 42% reported getting help from inmates. In each of these categories, the rate of assistance seems to be higher than it is for the same categories for the same sources from other income categories. Again, not terribly surprising. What was really interesting, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this, were the meanings that were associated with age and gender. What we discovered in our analysis was that young women, those 25 years old and younger, or younger than 25 years old, seem to be privileged in terms of the receipt of the assistance that they received. They both received received assistance at a higher rate from different sources, but also received different kinds of help at higher rates. Similar to young men, they about 45% got help securing bail. Similar to older women, about 45 to about 45% received help or in the form of emotional support. But where young women really stood out was in terms of the receiving information that both help them to navigate their lives in jail, but also receiving information to get out. And a higher percentage also seem to receive help having others contact their loved ones or work contacts or school contacts to let them know that something was going on, so as not to disrupt their lives too much. So young women seem to be the source that they at the very least received a similar rate of assistance with regards to bail and with regards to emotional support, but they also were more likely to receive information and help contacting others. And a lot of this assistance, this extra assistance that they seem to get, seem to come from other inmates. They were particularly, in this category in particular, seem to really stand out. And to a much lesser extent, this was also the case for system agents. And so one of the things I would like to talk about is what was going on here. And we're going to use Mary's case as a way to get at that. I'll first start by telling you how Mary, towards the end of the interview with her, described her experiences in detention. Mary says, well, I think after the whole thing, I mean, I'm really lucky that it was, I guess, traumatic in some sort of way, but I think I'm really lucky. It wasn't this huge traumatic experience where like I was assaulted in jail or like, as far as people who work there and everything, everyone was really actually quite amazing to me. Um, it was just the actual experience of being arrested, that it happened, that was more surprising. But being in there itself, I was only there for a few hours, but from that few hours alone, if I had to be there for 3 days and knowing I had to be there right now, if I had to go, I could probably handle it. It wasn't horrible. Who knows? Maybe stuff happened after I left. I don't know. So I don't want to go back or anything. But if I had to say, I'd say 3 stars. So, it wasn't that bad. You can be very clear that very few people describe their jail experience in this way, like, applauding how nice everyone was, etc. This was not a typical description of how people experience jail. So why was Mary's experience so great? 3 stars, I guess, out of 5. So in part, it was because Mary was treated with a great deal of kindness and care, and by a number of different folks who related to this her experience in jail. First, she was perceived as innocent, and having others respond to her with this care and gentleness. And there are lots of examples of this, and particularly with regards to young women. So she describes this process where she's engaging with folks, the guards in jail. She says actually throughout the whole process, everyone was relatively nice, but it seemed like everyone else in there knew each other. And they were talking to each other. Oh, hey, you're back again. Hey, girl, I've seen you over in this other jail. And she is kind of, acting like what she describes as a little puppy. I'm like this little puppy, and she's making these crying noises. So in contrast to everyone else who seems to be quite comfortable in this context, and they have been here so many times before, they know each other. She is shivering like a leaf and making crying noises, right? So she's kind of emoting, performing a kind of, sorry about that, performing a kind of innocence and helplessness, and it has an effect. So then the guards, the officers, start to ask her, well, why are you here? What did you do? Like, they couldn't believe that she would be someone who belonged here, and in fact said, you don't really belong here. And so they're looking through her file, and they can't figure out why she's here. And she says, I don't know either. I have no idea. And at this point, she really didn't know why she had been arrested. But it wasn't just about the officers. The bail bondsman that I kind of alluded to earlier, who's also critical towards her getting released fairly quickly, in part because he assumed either her innocence or her redeemability. I think it was mostly her innocence. So she says, I went to county, and because I was charged with 2 felonies, my bail was $95,000. I called my friend and she's like, I only have 7,000 because if you come up with 10%, you can use this to get out. And the bail bondsman was like, instead of saying, well, that's not enough, you need 9,500, says, well, it just sounds like something, some weird misunderstanding, her arrest. Didn't seem like, it's not quite clear that this should have happened. You don't really sound like someone who would do this. It just sounds like something weird happened. And so I'm going to give you a discount on your bail, basically. And then she laughs in telling the story. So he did. He gave me a discount on the bail so her friend could then use her resources to bail her out at this lower rate than she would have received. Here again, she's also being perceived as someone who doesn't belong. She's a young woman. It seems like this is all very new to her. It's difficult for these folks to believe that she is someone who is a criminal. She doesn't fit the stereotypes that they have of criminality. And even if she did do something wrong, she occurs as someone who's redeemable. But it wasn't just the bail bondsman or the officers. Inmates also stepped up in a big way to help Mary both understand what the process was like, what she could expect, etc. Because despite the assistance that officers offered, they really didn't tell her much about the process itself. And that created a kind of sense of confusion and concern, which was alleviated by other inmates. So Mary tried to use the phone, but she couldn't. It ends up being a complicated process, and you need to know you needed instructions on how to do so. She wasn't given those instructions, and so it was another inmate who informed her what she needed to do, that she needed to wait to get the information she needed so that she could dial out. Another inmate explained more explicitly how she should use the phone. Another inmate advised Mary that she should eat something because it was going to be unclear how long it was going to take her to get released. Mary thought when she was told she would be released, it would happen within an hour. The other inmates were like, yeah, that's probably not going to be the case. This is going to take a lot longer. Please do eat something. Otherwise you will regret it. And then the person that she ended up sharing a cell with also helped her just to understand what was going on in the place. So she says, she explained the process to me. So when they called everyone, I was like, what are we doing? What's going on? And then she says, oh, we're going upstairs. And I say, well, why? And she's like, well, that's where we sleep. And she says, but I'm leaving. I called. He said, I'm leaving. And she's like, well, you got to go upstairs. So we ended up being cellmates, and her cellmate helped to calm her nerves and gave her other advice about various things. Mary was hardly the only young woman specifically, to receive this kind of attention that few others outside of young women reported. 21-year-old Latina says that she was offered mental health services because the guards could tell that she was in distress. So she didn't ask for the services. She, I guess, was also behaving in ways that suggested that she was not in a good place. And so they volunteered this to her. Again, I can't stress enough to you how infrequently this kind of thing happened to folks who were held, unless they were young women. Another young white woman was aided by inmates who tried to show her how to make her bed based on jail standards. The agents in the jail put her in a private cell during the first night because she told the officers that she was feeling stressed during intake. During the periods of time when I spent observing the bookings, et cetera, in Louisville Metro Corrections, I can assure you that there were a few instances where guards came to someone and offered them any kind of assistance when they described themselves as being stressed in any way. But this agent did this. Another guard told her about the OR process and told her that she was likely a good candidate for it, and that helped to calm her, reduced her stress. And then another young Black woman, she reported that she didn't know why she was going to jail at the time she was pregnant. She pleaded with the officer. I'm asking him, do you all know if I have to stay the night? Do you all know? And she's just crying, right? I don't know what's going on here. And then he seen how shook up I was, and he kind of could tell. So she probably really don't know what's going on here, is what she's thinking. The officer is thinking about her. So yeah, they kind of, because they don't put me in handcuffs, and he said he was supposed to. So because she was showing some kind of distress, he allowed her kind of freedom that he reported was against the rules, being flexible in a case where he otherwise was not supposed to be so. So she's suggesting that because of the way in which she responded to her situation, situation, the kind of crying and the concern and the shock, etc. Those officials responded to her in a way that suggested that they wanted to be, they were showing care, they were showing concern. This again was primarily the experience of young women. But perhaps it's not just that there are these stereotypes of criminality and ideas of redeemability that don't kind of align with being a young woman. Perhaps it's not about the performances of innocence and helplessness, the crying and the appearance of shock and stress that's bringing it on. Maybe it's because for many of these young women, this is their first arrest, and people who are arrested for the first time. Are less likely or are more likely to receive this kind of help. So we looked at this, trying to figure out whether the number of arrests mattered. We contrasted the experiences of those who've been arrested once with those who've been arrested 2 to 5 times, 6 to 10 times, 11 times or more. There does seem to be a relationship between the number of arrests and the source of support. Here, though, I want to point out that when we look at those in the first arrest category, mostly the higher rate of support comes with inmates and penal system agents. That is by and large driven by these young women, not so much other inmates. And we also noticed that with regards to the form of assistance or the type of assistance that people are receiving in this situation, those who've been arrested once don't seem all that privileged over others. What I suggest is happening instead is that this is about these young women. When we compare their experiences to older women who've been arrested for the first time, we certainly do not find this kind of care, this kind of nurturing, this kind of attentiveness. Carol was a 34-year-old Black woman, single with a 16-year-old son. She explains, as she explained it, the fact that this was her first arrest made no difference to guards at all. Well, I remember they automatically assumed I had an arrest and that I had been to jail before, the guards on shift. And then when I didn't know the rules, they were like, "Oh, wait, you haven't been arrested before." She was like, "No, not every Black woman has been arrested." The guard was surprised. And then Carol goes on to say they were playing games with me. So now they know she's not been arrested before. This is her first time. This is typically when the younger women would get some kind of assistance, either information or some special place to rest their heads. But for Carol, they put her in a cell with mentally ill people who were screaming and yelling all night. She felt like she was in fact kind of being punished. They were banging their heads previously to being in the cell with me, who could obviously not be trusted to be alone. These are the people that they roomed her with. And so she felt again that they were playing games with her, in some ways trying to harm her. Young men weren't treated so well with first arrest either. They weren't offered help at the same rate as young women, and the nature of assistance that they were offered was not the same. So they weren't offered spaces if they looked stressed, etc. They weren't offered a whole lot of information that allowed them to navigate their way out of jail sooner than they might have otherwise. There were some situations, exceptions to this rule. For instance, one guard offered a 19-year-old Latino the use of his cell phone when he was being booked in. This was critically important because most of us no longer remember telephone numbers. We have everything in our cell phones. Once they take the cell phone away from you, it's hard to contact people when you're in jail because you no longer remember those numbers. And so this particular guard said, "Hey, you want to go on your phone now, get the names and telephone numbers of people that you need to call later, because that's going to be critical for you." Very few of our respondents reported this kind of assistance, which ends up being really critical for facilitating release. But by and large, young men were not treated in the way that young women were. So once we take young women into consideration, first arrests seem less important. The number of arrests, however, still matter, but mostly in terms of having excessive arrests. And that's a point I'll turn to a little bit later. Before then, let me introduce you to Jesus. He will be our entry point to a few other factors that we found to be important. He was a 23-year-old San Francisco native, a Latino, single with no children, full-time job, making $500 a week or thereabouts, while also attending college. He'd been arrested twice, once as a juvenile. The most recent was in terms of assault with a deadly weapon. which he was later, a case that was later dismissed because there was a lack of evidence. He had not, it seems as if he had not done this at all, had gotten caught up in something. But before that was revealed, he spent 4 days in jail for this most recent charge before being bailed out. So when Jesus was in jail, he contacted his cousin to let him know that he was in jail. His cousin contacted his father to let his father know that he was in jail. The cousin also then contacted his employer to say, Jesus won't be able to come into to work for a couple of days, and came up with some reason so that Jesus would not get in trouble with the employer. So he didn't implicate him in terms of his jail experience, but he did let the employer know that something was going on. The father moved his car so that it wouldn't get towed, and then helped him secure bail afterwards. Putting down $1,000 off of a $10,000 bail assessment. And then once Jesus exited jail, he sold his car and paid his father back for the help that he got to get released from jail. Jesus's case suggests the following kind of predictors. One, detainee status seems to matter a whole heap in this situation. The strength of family ties and the ability and willingness of these ties to step up and assist also becomes important. And then we'll get back to the number of arrests, focusing on these excessive arrests and what that means for the erosion of social capital. This won't be surprising to you at all. Those who had jobs who were received help of different types at a higher rate, and also from different sources. 87, 88% with a job received information during this process, compared to 70% of those without a job. Importantly, and maybe perhaps most importantly, 62% received help with bail, compared to just a third of those without a job. I'll move on just because of time limitations. They also received help from different sources at a higher rate, with the exception of family. Those with a job received help from partners, friends, penal system agents, and inmates at slightly higher rates across the board. And so it really increased the likelihood that they would be getting some kind of help from anyone, much more than those without a job. And it's not surprising why this would be the case. Earners are workers, which accords a kind of dignity and respect. They're worthy and deserving of assistance, but there are kind of more practical concerns as well. Earners might lose the jobs that help them to support their families and themselves. And so the longer you keep them in, the greater the likelihood they'll lose those jobs and lose that key source of support. And earners can also repay family members and friends who bail them out. Those who do not have jobs are much less able to be able to do that kind of thing. So employment matters for a number of reasons. Strength of ties was also important. So we asked our respondents a series of questions about the nature of the relationships with family members. This is specific to their family connections, how involved they want family members to be in their lives, how supportive they think, generally speaking, their family members are, but also in terms of kind of instrumental support. Here we asked them about whether or not, or how strongly they felt like they could rely on members of their family if they needed someone to talk to, if they needed advice for a personal problem, help with finding a place to live, help with getting a job, transportation, to get to appointments, whatever, and some financial support. And then and then we also asked them, for each of those categories, how many people in your family do you feel like you could rely on for these kinds of support? And what we see with these three different kind of measures family level social capital, that that those who described their families, relatively speaking, as being very close, and who could rely on their family members for these, other kinds of kinds of help or assistance. These people were far more likely to say that they were helped during the process of detention to get released or to survive in this context. So upwards of 90% of those who said they were very close to their family received help. 94% of those who said that their families were very instrumental received help during this experience. And then about 78% of those who could identify a number of folks, they were fairly high in terms of the number of folks that they could point to who could help, also said that they received help. That was true, but to a lesser extent of those who were kind of on the medium level in terms of the kind of support that their family members offered in general. So having being embedded in families that provided lots of access to social capital and seemed to be willing to mobilize made a difference. But there are caveats to this. I want to introduce you to Janice, 25-year-old Black woman, San Francisco native, single with a 3-year-old son. She had been arrested on a bench warrant for $10,000, OR'd very quickly because this was her first arrest, at least as an adult. She was relieved. She did get OR'd, and she got OR'd very quickly. And so she didn't need to rely on family members and friends to get her out. Although she didn't, before she knew that, she was really stressing, fretting about how she would get out and whether or not her family members would step up for her. And friends. And she said part of the reason why she was relieved is because she knew that if she had reached out to her and tried to rely on her friends, this is not family, but friends who she felt very close to, she knew that they would not be there for her. She said, no, if I had called them, they would have been like, girl, what you in jail for? Girl, you better knock that whole time out. You're going to be all right. We're going to see you on Saturday, like that. Not know how much is your bail. We'll figure out how to get to bail. It would have been none of that, because all of my friends have been to jail, and they'd be like, it's nothing. It's nothing to them. So here, it wasn't about closeness that her friends wouldn't show up to her. Spending time in jail was a kind of rite of passage. If you live in communities where the jail experience is typical because your community is a target of attention by law enforcement, and so that's a typical experience. In this situation, it was just a matter of that's what you have to do. Show that you can do it like the rest of us. It's a rite of passage. So the failure to step up in this situation, at least with regards to bailing out, was a function of that, not that they lack closeness. But there are ways that an erosion of social capital could that there are some factors that led to an erosion of social capital that made it very difficult for people to get the help that they needed. I'm going to return to the case of Janice. I mentioned that her first arrest as an adult was the one that we just discussed. But Janice had a number of arrests as a juvenile. So although she had only been arrested once as an adult, as a juvenile, she'd been arrested 8 times, she estimates. She described suffering from anxiety, depression, ADHD throughout her adolescence, which likely contributed to behaviors that led to her penal system contact. After the first arrest for fighting with other girls in the neighborhood, she described being frightened about going to jail. She was 13 years old at the time. She said, yes, I'm going to jail. Oh my gosh, I'm going to get into trouble because this is the auntie that always she was my guardian. So she had to always come save me. I'm getting in trouble, you all. I'm going to jail. She ain't never going to come and get me after this. I'm going to be stuck. And after a while, she really stopped coming. So after repeated numbers of times in jail, her auntie refused to come and let her out. Because her aunt stopped showing up for her during her adolescence, Janice did not expect her to do the same this time around. And so she was surprised to learn that if they had to, her aunties and her mother would have in fact bailed her out. So she was asked about the support that her aunties expressed, and she said, yeah, when I got home, they was like, how was it? I know you was mad. And then I told them what happened or whatever. And my auntie, the one I live with here, she was like, I bet you ain't never going to do that again. And so they have this conversation, and so she basically says, my auntie and my mom, they was going to come together, I guess, get me out of jail. It felt good because they know I don't be doing nothing anymore, and I'm sitting in jail pregnant. I'm pregnant, so they really felt bad. Like, oh my gosh, it's her first grandbaby, their first great grandnephew, so they really like, oh no, we got to get her out of jail. So as an adolescent, her frequent run-ins with the law helped to erode the possibilities of social capital mobilization for help while with pretrial release. However, by staying out of trouble for a number of years, her mother and her aunt came to believe that she had been redeemed in a way, and so they were willing to help again. It seems that redemption is possible in circumstances like this, but there are a number of examples in the data that suggest that not everyone is so lucky. Kevin was a 37-year-old Pacific Islander, also a San Francisco native, father of one. He was unemployed. He was housing insecure. He relied primarily on government assistance to get by. He was arrested after police discovered that he had a bench warrant for missing court dates. In fact, many of his over 25 arrests that he reported were associated with bench warrants. He spent 3 weeks in pretrial detention before being ordered on one of these that brought him to our attention. Although many who were interviewed for this project were desperate for release, Kevin wasn't so pressed because he didn't have anywhere to go. No one on the outside was waiting for him. His family had all but given up on him by this time, and so they neither expected nor wanted to hear from him. They certainly would not bail him out. He had a few friends, but they were all tied up with their own lives, he reported. He had no pets to feed and no home to attend to. He had nothing to do because he was without a job, no classes to make up. So he felt like it was just prudent to not to take any extraordinary measures toward release. Release would come soon enough, and he would just wait the system out. This was in good part because he knew his family members would not come to his aid. He said, I didn't even get on the phone because there's just no point in calling my family. I'm here in jail again. Good for you. Stay there, they'll tell me. Just stay there. It's good for you to stay there. It's a better place for you. Like, what? Really? That's what I've got to deal with, Like I said in the beginning, I don't have the support from my family, and I'm trying to just survive out there. And again, the few friends that he had, he felt like were too busy with their own lives to help him out. And there's another example I could mention, but because of time, I won't. In this example, this young man, 25 years old, had been arrested multiple times. He also suffered from co-occurring disorders. He also struggled with being unhoused. He came from a family of some means. And so for many of the times, the early times that he had been arrested, his mother would show up for him time and time again, time and time again. But then she got to a point where she said she wasn't going to be there for me anymore. She had already told him this once before. They hadn't spoken for a while. And then when they reconnected, I ended up getting in trouble again. So this was after she was helping me out with a hotel and that kind of stuff. And then she said, until you're ready to really get serious, I can't be doing this anymore. So that as arrests mounted, family members began to fall away, often frustrated and saddened by their loved one's inability to find another path, and perhaps also angered by what likely appeared to be waste of efforts from the past. So for these folks, those folks with excessive arrest, individuals are less likely to reach out for help and even if they try to get help from social ties, including family members, relatively few would show up for them. This is in part because in terms of reaching out to folks, because they've been in jail for so many times, they actually had the information they needed, and they perhaps didn't need as much emotional support. They knew what it took to get through, to get by in jail. So that wasn't much needed. But there's also this issue of becoming a burden. They felt like they were becoming a burden, and they were responded to as if they were burdens. A disproportionate share suffered from housing instability, joblessness, mental health disorders, and other social and economic ills. And these worked to strain their family relations over time to the point where it just got too much for family members to deal with. And it got too much for them to even reach out to ask for help. And even if they were released sooner, there was the issue of what difference would it really make, because their situations were so problematic. It's not like being released would substantially improve their life circumstances. And so a lot just felt like, what's the point? I just will ride this out until it's done, and I'll be released when I'm released. I would get back to this point about what the advocates for the current system contend, and that is that this is a system, the money bail system is a system that allows individuals of all financial means to leverage their social networks and community ties to obtain pretrial release. What we're finding is that there are a whole host of factors that contribute, often that have very little to do with whether or not the person is deserving or undeserving, more so than anyone else. And yet it shapes whether or not people can rely on the networks, what networks they can rely on, what kinds of help they can get. There are a whole host of reasons to be concerned about the current bail system that we have in place, but to suggest that the networks in some ways will help us to identify those who are worthy of protecting and saving, and those who aren't, is deeply problematic for a whole host of reasons that I hope came across in this presentation. The summary of what matters: financial capital, being embedded in households with a fair amount of income, can be it doesn't have to be truly high, but it has to be high enough to support exit from jail with bail. Employment matters. People who are employed much more likely to get help, get different sources, different kinds of help, and from different sources. Being embedded in families that are tightly knit, that come to each other's aid, dramatically increases the likelihood that you will get help if you are in jail of various forms. And also, we need to take into consideration cultural norms and understandings, the sense of deservingness, who's worthy of getting help in what context, how that's linked to our stereotypes about criminality becomes important in this context. The idea that some are redeemable and others are not also seems to matter here as well. And then finally, pretrial detention as a rite of passage, whether or not one gets help might be at least in part a function of whether or not you see this experience as something that you must go through as a kind of rite of passage to show your worth in your community. These all became really important to understanding the experiences of my respondents. I will end there and very much look forward to your comments and questions.
Thanks so much for that. Now, okay, the way we'll do the questions is feel free to write your question in the chat box or also use the raise hand function. I know we already have a question, and maybe I'll start with that. So Edmund, I think you had a question. Would you like to ask that? Right now, Edmund, you're muted.
Thank you for your very interesting paper, which has focused on those who are arrested. I wonder if we could turn it the other way up and focus and have a look at the motivations of those who are giving help. Can you say anything about what is motivating the helpers rather than the helped?
So I can't, because I did not interview helpers, nor did I interview my respondents with an eye towards understanding circumstances where they might have helped others in this situation. So in my prior research, when I focused on the deployment of or mobilization of social capital for job finding, and when I interviewed those respondents, I interviewed them both as job seekers and those who were in a position to help, the job contacts. And so I could use them as a resource for making sense of one or the other position. In this situation, I'm solely asking folks about their experience within the context of detention, who they relied on, who they decided to avoid altogether in circumstances where that was the case, et cetera. I don't have a good sense about what the motivations were of those who did help, because I didn't ask those folks. And so I would feel uncomfortable. What I think the patterns are suggesting, though, is, so you asked, why would folks help? I think in the context of we could make some, we could speculate within the context of family members who are helping. I mean, my sense is they're both concerns that are rooted in material considerations, but also the sense that you need to be there for the people who are a part of your, forgive me, tribe. So material aspects, but especially when you are employed, having someone who is in jail or in prison, someone who is in a circumstance that might negatively affect their ability to maintain their employment, to contribute to the household, that becomes a threat. And so you want to reduce that threat as quickly as possible. You get them out. It might lead to some debt. You could pay that off over time, but that might be easier to deal with than losing a job and then struggling to get a new job later on. But there are also issues with regards to people feeling like they needed to stand up for the folks that their family members and friends. We have a number of respondents who reported telling their family members, don't do this. I'm going to be released within a couple of days. Don't bail me out. It doesn't make any sense. It didn't matter. The family members were there that day working hard to get the bail and to bail these folks out. So even when requesting, saying no, no, no. And we find that was much more likely to happen for people who were embedded in these very kind of tight family networks, the networks of family members who showed up in lots of different circumstances. This just ended up being a circumstance where they would show up again. So it suggests a kind of family culture of showing up for each other, but also that's rooted in the sense that this is what we do. We are close, you can rely on me, etc. Trying to think of other situations. With regards to the young women, I do think a lot of folks felt like they took on this role of protector, whether it was the jail staff or the other inmates, especially when someone appeared to be helpless, innocent, taking on the role of the person who informed them about what the process was like, kind of soothed their concerns, quieted the anxieties that they felt. I think it allowed a lot of people to feel like they had a kind of worth themselves, that they were helping to navigate this person. Some suggested, one time I gave this talk again last week, and someone suggested maybe this was an effort to set things up so that you could exploit later on. But many of these people were out in a couple of days, so there wasn't much time for exploitation. Who you saw that day was not necessarily who you would see the next day. So I don't think a lot of it was about exploitation. I think it was about feeling like, I'm someone who is in this position, I'm an inmate in jail. This allows me to feel some sense of worth, that I could be of assistance. I can calm someone, I could soothe someone. And so people did that. And I think that was the case, both of the guards when they did help, in a few circumstances where they did help, and also of the other inmates. I would need to think through other cases, but those are the things that came to mind. And it's the best I can do, given that I didn't actually ask people why, who did help, why they helped.
So we have a question from Miranda now.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really fascinating. I've got a kind of observation and a couple of questions. So I recently did some research talking to children about their experiences in police custody, so a shorter time frame and immediately post-arrest. I was really interested to hear your observations about Mary and the young women and the kind of identification of innocence, helplessness, and redeemability. In police custody, from the young people that I spoke to's perspective, they felt often that they weren't provided the protections that should be available to them, but those that did experience them often described an experience in which they were behaving in a way that might be perceived in the same way. And in that research, I was talking to police officers, etc., who were dealing with these young people, and they very much identified that if you look like the proverbial, as they put it, rabbit in headlights, innocent, particularly young, if you look younger than the others, if you were a first timer, then they would be much more prepared to provide the sort of protections that actually they should be providing to all the children in that setting. So it's really interesting to hear that you were seeing that too, albeit in a different setup.
Miranda, have you written any of this up? Because I would love to read what it is that you are seeing in your day. It's helpful to have other sources that could confirm that.
It's coming. I'll send you an email. We should talk. So a couple of questions that I had. One of them relates to mental health input. So you talked about kind of professionals generally, and of course the importance and prevalence of mental health conditions. And I just wondered, I was just interested to know if you were able to reflect a bit more on the division between sort of legal help and mental health help, and how that was mediated for the individuals that you were speaking to. And then the other question that I had related to help from families. So children in police custody in this country have an adult who comes down, and quite often that's a family member. And it was interesting that young people talked about their anxiety about feeling a burden, and for those with repeated arrests, not wanting to burden family members more. I mean, obviously a family member has to come and wait in custody rather than in your setting give money. But I was wondering whether any of that operated as a kind of reluctance factor or impinged upon their ability to mobilize that social capital. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for this, Miranda. In terms of mental health help versus legal or emotional, right? Because some of it was just, it's going to be okay. You're going to navigate this. We all have, or some such thing. So emotional and some legal assistance. Mental health help was not. I mean, with the exception of, to the extent that I think what we should probably do is to distinguish between the mental health episodes that might be associated with a chronic illness, and just the upset associated with being in jail perhaps for the first time, right? So a number of these young women described shock, and they were just so frightened and they looked so frightened. One could argue that they were going through a kind of mental health episode and got read that way. I think the issue, though, in this situation, Miranda, is that for a lot of people who were experiencing, because they had mental health issues, upsets that seem to be linked to that, more than anything else, they became kind of pariahs, right? People actually wanted to stay away from them. They weren't drawn to them. They weren't being very helpful. The institution itself provided very little assistance for people who were struggling with mental health issues. And then other inmates, I think there's a way that they both feared and disdained people with mental health concerns. So they could deal with the upset young woman, right? That was almost normative, right? That this is what and if you could just soothe them, they'll be okay. And no idea what to do with someone who seemed to be having other kinds of struggles. And the truth is they probably didn't, but the institution didn't either, right? I want to be able to look at some, I did some runs yesterday to show you, to be able to indicate to you how many people said that they didn't get the kind of assistance they needed with regards to mental health care, and it would take me too much to do so, and I fear estimating incorrectly, but there was a large enough percentage who by day 3, 4 started to complain that their mental health issues were not being tended to. So that was a thing. The institution doesn't do it. And also, for the most part, inmates also did not feel like that was something that they want. They were repelled by it. And they felt like it was punishment to be put by it. To be put by people who were struggling in this way. And so when we hear reports of people being put into cells with other people who they thought were mentally ill, they saw that as punishment. And I'm pretty sure, given the patterns, that the guards were doing it as punishment. So there were kind of categories of people that you would be punished by being roomed with. Sexual predators, that was someone you were put in a cell with someone like that, you're being punished. People with mental health illnesses, you might remember Carol's remark that, the guards didn't realize that because she was an older Black woman, wasn't that old, she was 34, but maybe old by these standards, she was presumed to have been arrested before. She said that she felt it was a kind of punishment. They were playing with her by putting her in the cell with these mentally ill people who were screaming all night. There was very little support offered for them for that reason at all. In fact, if anything, people described their situations as being repelled by them, not understanding, kind of frightened by them. And if anything, it was punishment to be placed in the context where they had to be in close proximity to them. With regards to families and the ability to mobilize, I might actually need you to restate this particular question. Yeah, so if you wouldn't mind very quickly restating it. Write it down quickly enough.
Not at all. It was just the question about whether many of your participants were reluctant to ask for family help because of feeling a burden rather than the fact that family had drifted away, but not wanting to engage for that reason.
Yeah, not sure that I would describe it as burden. A small percentage, but significant still. I mean, the issue is if you can't get out, most people can't get out with help. And so to the extent that that was your case, you would have to eventually make contact. If you can make contact with friends without letting your family know, as in the case of Mary, that's what you did. Not a lot of people were in that situation. The people who had more of their own resources to rely on, those are the people who could actually act on not letting their family members and friends know what their situation was. So my sense is that a much higher percentage than actually we see in our data or in this data would have preferred to not let anyone know what had happened. But because they needed help to get out, they did, whomever they could. But there's a small percentage of those among those who were able to get out without assistance. a number of those did so without help because they knew they can get away with doing it without ever letting their people know. They didn't want their people to know they got caught up with the system. And that was less about a burden. That was more about the stigma attached with being arrested and jailed. And so for many, they just kept the secret going as long as they could. Mary never told her parents and would never tell her parents. So in those situations, I think my sense is that it's less about the stigma and more about trying to protect, the burden is more about protecting themselves from the stigma that's associated with it, or maybe the shame that they feel like they will feel if their family members will find out. One woman worked her ass off to get out as quickly as possible because she knew her grandmother, who she was in touch with every day, would be calling her and getting upset about not getting in touch with her. So she literally said, I needed to get out as quickly as possible because I knew my grandmother was probably calling me and she would want to know where I was. And the longer I stayed in, the more likely she would find out. And I couldn't have her find out. This would be so upsetting to her. And I feel so much shame. And so she worked on getting out without most of her family members finding out for this reason. So for some respondents, burden might have been a concern, but not so much that it stopped them from reaching out for help. I thought stigma was a much more powerful kind of motivator in terms of whether or not folks reached out, who they reached out to, and how quickly they tried to get out of jail, if that makes sense. Thank you. Let's stay in touch.
There's a question from Johan. Johan, do you want to ask it?
Thank you, Dr. Owen. Thank you also, Professor Smith, for your time. Really appreciate it. Professor Smith, I'm mindful that the question I'm about to ask invites you to speculate beyond the data. And if you don't want to do that, you're welcome to just decline and we'll move on to the next person. That's totally fine. I won't feel affront or anything. My interest is in prosecutorial decision-making because after some, I worked in the San Francisco Public Defender's Office for a while, and I have maintained ever since that the most important person in the district attorney's office is not the district attorney, it's the charging attorney, the one who decides whether or not a particular case is going to be processed through the felony unit or the misdemeanor unit. And it's the misdemeanor unit that is where your findings take place. And I can't help but wonder about this upstream deliberation about the path that fork in the road where the charging attorney is deciding that someone is going to go through the path that lands a case on Sandra Smith's sample. And I'm wondering whether the social capital effects that you've described today, whether you would speculate they are more or less pronounced, or depending on whether or not someone is processed as a misdemeanor case or a felony case. Because I can imagine competing stories. One, that it's the social capital effects you observe are more pronounced, and I can imagine a story where the social capital effects you describe are less pronounced. And I'm just wondering whether you'd be willing to kind of speculate about the ways these findings land, given how someone has been processed through the system. I hope that makes some sense.
I think it does make sense, Johan. And so I will admit to you that I haven't thought about this deeply, but I do think it's a really great question and is worth spending time to think about. What has been on my mind is that, so like Mary, a number of folks were initially charged with felonies that then got kind of bargained down to, pled down to one or more misdemeanors, which then makes them eligible for pretrial, for the pretrial diversion program. And it strikes me that well, here's the thing, what difference would it make? I think I can imagine it both ways too. One of the things that occurred to me is that it's the folks who have some measure of social capital who can bargain in such a way that allows the charges to be brought down so that they can be released quicker, and they accept diversion, which is in part how I come to find them, because it enables them to kind of get through the system without a mark as long as they complete successfully. And so I'm thinking about cases like Mary, where she was able to bail herself out. She got a lawyer who provided her with really good advice. Um, um, about different approaches she could take. She felt fairly well informed, and supported, again, through this whole process in ways that not very many other people felt. I do feel like access to various forms of social capital enabled her to be in a position that she was in, that allowed her to plead in the way that felt comfortable to her and get what she needed. But the problem is that even for folks who lack that kind of social capital, waiting the system out itself leads to the kind of plea that allows for a misdemeanor charge and exit through diversion, right? The difference is whether or not you get there through bail, which probably is a result of kind of, coming up with resources fairly early in the process and getting out sooner, or you wait it out because bail is too hard to come by, but it eventually comes and you're OR'd, and you are OR'd with this kind of plea deal. We'll let you out and then you can take on diversion, and be done with this. And so in the one instance, we have the people with some social capital that enables the earlier exit, but still through diversion. And in the second case, these are people who have much less social capital, lots of capital. They wait the system out because that's all they can really do. And the system is clogged. They want to get people out. So here, take this plea deal. It means diversion. We'll reduce these charges and you're out that way. So in both situations, there's an exit that comes. In one situation, the exit probably comes earlier because of the social capital access and mobilization. In the second case, you don't have that much to rely on. And so, but it ends up happening because you're still in a clogged system, a system that needs to release itself. So inevitably, those people get the offer too. It just takes a few more days before they get it. I should say very briefly that among my Black respondents, although they were assessed bail at similar rates and not much higher than others in my sample, they're far less likely to get out from bail than their counterparts, in part because they didn't get the resources to do so. They didn't have the resources to do so. They didn't have the family networks to step up for them. There are probably these rites of passage issues as well. So they didn't have the capital that would have led to early exit. And so they waited and they eventually got OR'd and they got the deal for diversion, a lowering of the whatever charges, and that allowed for their exit. The difference there was that it happened later for them and without social capital, but it did happen. So I think, to me, in this particular system at this level, it is about how long it takes to get there, less in some cases about whether or not. So social capital matters, but probably in terms of how long it takes you to get through that process. That's what I want to say. But it is something I should pay closer attention to because I think it's a great question.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today.
So I have a question. I'm going to take the liberty of asking a few of my questions, if that's okay. What I want to start off with, so I have a few. Let me start with one, which is I'm thinking about this, this idea of who's in the family, especially as you said that, it's a lot of mothers and sisters and to some extent fathers who are providing the support. And what I'm wondering is, in terms of social capital, because women are often doing sort of care work and kin work as daughters and as sisters, as mothers for each other, do you think that's playing a part in being able to mobilize social capital in terms of even who thinks the family is close or that they have the instrumental family? Partly because, as we know from other research, right, that daughters get more both instrumental and emotional support from parents, usually mothers. So do you think this is an extension of that aspect of social capital? That's my first question. Where does gender play a part, aside from sort of being young and innocent, whether it's just about being embedded in networks as, like a young woman, as opposed to a young man?
Can I answer that question? Because I don't want, and then you can ask, we can keep going back and forth. I just don't want to forget. With regards to, so if I were to focus on I think it's a great question, what the dynamics are that are playing themselves out in this particular situation. With regards to the young women, and this is my way of trying to answer the question, who seem to be getting help at higher rates, that help at higher rates wasn't coming from the family, right? They were getting help at a similar rate as the other groups, with the exception of older men. Older men weren't getting much help from anybody. As the other categories. So in that situation, family members weren't stepping up any more than they were for young men or older women. And I actually should say, one of my students had a separate paper that looked at gender differences and also by parental status. And it certainly seemed like women who had children were actually in some ways demeaned a lot more than men, because there's a perception that if you're a woman and you're a mother, you shouldn't be engaged and you shouldn't be involved in criminal activity. Something's really wrong with you, and it's more normative for the men to be involved with criminal activity. But with regards to this idea that, there is this kind of active engagement in the family between mothers and daughters, especially doing all sorts of things for each other and for other family members. I think that is quite true, but I don't think that is playing itself out so well here, because they're getting helped at the same rate as other kind of gender age groups, with, again, the exception of older men. They're the kind of assistance that they're receiving that seems to be at a higher rate is both from jail officials, but also other inmates. So there's something about those people who are seeing them as like the kind of rabbit in headlights, I think someone said earlier. So I'm not sure that dynamic is playing itself out as much.
That makes
with
sense.
regards to family. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have one more kind of substantive question, then I have a methodological one. The next substantive question that I had was, like, it's the women who I think who are the older women, sort of 25 plus, who are getting the least help, less than older men, in securing bail. Now I'm guessing securing bail would happen through help with family and friends who would know, for instance, whether a woman has sort of been arrested before, this idea of deservingness or whatever, they would have a sense of that, right? So I'm curious about why you think that's happening from people who would, presumably know the deservingness there.
Yeah. So another really interesting question. One, bail is coming primarily from family members, not so much from friends. I was surprised to see that. And so what might be, I think that there are a couple of factors that we should be taking into consideration. Women who are in the system, and especially so as they get older, are far more likely to have mental health issues, substance abuse issues. There's a way that women who are in the system are far more disadvantaged than men who otherwise look similar are in the system, right? It is actually more of a normative experience for a male to be arrested and spend, a little bit of time at least in jail, in a way that it's not the case for women. The women who do end up there tend to be far more disadvantaged. So they are poor, they're much more likely to have substance abuse issues or mental health issues, or a combination of the two. And so part of what I think is going on here is that we are dealing with a population that both has a deficit of the kind of resources that would be required. So they're living in households that are less likely to have those kinds of resources. They're also likely to have, in terms of you mentioned, you didn't call it reputation, I can't remember what the term was, but these are because of the kinds of issues that contribute to them going to jail. And in some cases, frequently, they are straining their networks in ways that I think would decrease the likelihood that they will get that kind of assistance. So there's both the material aspect, they're embedded in networks that are just poor and can't help as much. But there's also the issue of one's willingness, the network's willingness to come to their aid. And because of the kinds of issues that they're coping with, much more likely to be coping with than their male counterparts, they're actually engaged in relationships that have been strained in a way that reduces the likelihood of mobilization as well. One of the people that I did not talk about here is a young woman from Guatemala. She suffered from co-occurring disorders. She'd been picked up a couple of times because of fights with her mother. She lived with her mother. They constantly got into fights. And at least two of the times she was picked up, they actually got into physical fight, or she beat her mother. And so in situations like that, there's not always a beating associated with it, but there's a heavy strain, there's a heavy toll that takes over for family members who are coping with a family member who has these kinds of issues. And I think it wears people down. And having some distance from that person, especially if they're living with you, is probably a good thing. So you are less likely to respond. And the problem is that the women who end up in the system are more likely, especially as they age, are much more likely to look like that population, the population that's struggling with the kinds of illnesses, issues that make it very likely that they're straining their relationships. And then it's problematized further by the fact that these are women. They shouldn't be in this situation. They shouldn't be like this. Many of them are mothers. You're a crappy mother. So there's this added layer of all these judgments that are being placed that, again, makes it less likely that these women are going to get the kind of help that we might associate with that typically comes, I think, to women in need.
So I have one more question, but I know whatever the next question is has to be the last one. So I want to ask anyone else if they have a question instead. Ellie? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting talk. I'm struck by how much perception comes into everything that you're looking at there, and obviously the biases that stem with that. And when it comes to, the actual support that's proffered, in the stories that you were telling us, it was, for the young women, it was a preemptive, spontaneous offering of support, often without it even having to be explicitly asked for, or it was people preemptively deciding not to ask for support on the presumption that it wouldn't come. And presumably, obviously, in there as well, there's actual a request for support and support given. But what I haven't heard you speak about at all is the refusal to support once it's been asked for. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if that ends up occurring a lot, and what are the conditions and situations in which, when support is actually asked for, it's then explicitly denied.
Yeah. So often, thank you very much for that, Eleanor. Often it's a very similar situation to the Kevin case, except Kevin got so far down the line that he stopped asking. You get to a place where you realize they're not going to respond. So there are a number of respondents who were in situations where they were repeat offenders. I don't know if you might remember this from one of the slides, but I show how after 10 arrests, then the amount of the rate at which people were receiving help just declined significantly. And so around that time, that's when people are saying, no, I can't, I'm not going to do this. So there's one fellow that we interviewed as an example, 47 years old. He had been arrested a number of times. He described himself as a kind of petty thief, and then he became a drug addict, et cetera. It goes on and on. He had a father who owned his own business, et cetera, and who he reached out to, and this father was there for him. He gave him rides and did all sorts of other things, offered assistance in other contexts. And in a situation where he reached out to his father for help to get bailed out, his father said no. He said, well, I don't want anyone to have my information, right? Almost as if to suggest, I'm a system avoider. I don't want my information in the system. And for that reason, I won't go out of my way to help you out. I suspect it's more along the lines of other folks that I'm sick of doing this for you. I'm not going to do it anymore. He asked, his father said no. And then a couple of other women, including Janice that I mentioned here, she called her boyfriend. Remember, she was pregnant. She called her boyfriend. Her boyfriend was like, well, that's what you get. You shouldn't have been in the situation you were in. Maybe next time you won't get yourself into that situation. That was a no. And then there was another woman. She was when I interviewed her, she was about 50 or thereabouts. She got caught up in a kind of check writing fraud situation. And so she was being held for a couple of days. She called her boyfriend. That was someone who was living with her. He too did not help her. She didn't say he explicitly said no, but he didn't come soon after that relationship was over. So we do have examples of people who reached out and asked for assistance and had people turn them down. I should say too that those folks were, in my sample, were far more likely to be Black than other racial and ethnic backgrounds. They were coming from more, in some situations themselves, more disadvantaged backgrounds, but the networks that they were reaching out to weren't necessarily in that way. So the first man, his father owned his own business. He did have the resources to do what he needed to do. In each of these cases, it didn't seem to be the case that their networks lacked the resources to help, but they were making decisions that they were not willing to do so. So that was the case. There were also situations where people shared with family members that they were in this situation, were hopeful that they would get help, but really didn't think that they were. And so were surprised that their family members came through for them, even people that they had not had good relationships with. And that helped to kind of build ties beyond that. So we have examples in each of these cells, if you will. And it's interesting to see the patterns associated with who gets, who doesn't when explicitly asked or not. So yeah, thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, and thank you.
Sandra, thank you so much for being with us today. We're at the end of our time together, and thank you all for joining us today as well.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.